Today on the AI Impact podcast, we are discussing how to scale AI projects and all the difficulties, the challenges that happens along the way. And to do so, I'm joined by Professor Tomoko Yokoi, who is a professor at IMD Business School and specialized on digital transformation. She published and co-authored the book Digital Hacking. She's doing research at IMD Business School, one of the leading business schools, in their AI and digital transformation lab. And before this, she has been for 20 years in the industry. So she's really able to mix her business experience, board experience, executive experience with academic experience, as she also doing a PhD today focusing on the interaction between AI and humans from a cognitive research perspective. Hi, Tomoko. It's a huge pleasure to have you and to discuss about the AI impact today with you. And I'm really looking forward knowing more about your perspective, your experience. And to start, we discussed and we wanted to start with this metric. This metric that many people reported, shared. I think it was in Fortune or some outlets. That was MIT reports 95% on GenAI pilots at companies are failing. We can discuss about the quality of these metrics, but still I think it's an interesting starting point because often there are big claims about GenAI, but when you turn to businesses, actually it's not so clear the business impact and the impact. But first, I'm curious about your reaction to this metric.
Yes, it was. It got a lot of press coverage, and probably because it put a very big number. It had a bold number of 95%, I believe, that were of AI Gen AI initiatives did not provide. Um, well, actually, that were getting zero return on their investment. So I guess with these bold statements get a lot of coverage. So in that respect, there's been, a bit of criticism of how this report was developed. But nevertheless, regardless of this claim, what I did find interesting was that it captured something that I'd been hearing anecdotally since the beginning of 2025, which I thought was very different from what I'd been hearing in 2024. So in 2024, a lot of the conversations that I heard were about how many organizations were really interested in adopting Gen AI, and there was a lot of discussion about piloting and experimenting with this new technology. And I think we heard a lot of discussions, we heard a lot of case examples related to that. And then in the beginning of 2025 onwards, anecdotally, there were a lot of stories about, oh, we were a little bit disappointed that the Gen AI initiatives didn't come out as didn't work as we had expected, or that there were sort of anecdotal discussions on it's hallucinating a bit too much, so we really can't use it. So all of a sudden, compared to the positive anecdotes that I was hearing a lot of, I mean, this is not even statistically correct, but it's just anecdotally hearing about. And then in 2025, it was a little bit more subdued. So in that respect, I found that this report was sort of in that same line of the subduing of the AI adoption and what it means. So in that respect, I thought it was interesting because it sort of seemed to ride this wave of this anecdotal conversations that were going on. And it is true when I speak to some technology analysts and when I speak to some organizations during my research, anecdotally, many did tell me that they were still trying to figure out how to best use Gen AI, and how to best use it, not really for to not have any bold statements about ROI, but really just about, well, where can they get the most value out of it? So I believe that in that the organizations are still trying to figure out how to use this new technology and how to do it well.
And I really like the fact that you split clearly between Gen AI and broad term AI, because indeed the report was about Gen AI project. And here it seems that indeed there's less clarity. There was a lot of hype since ChatGPT 3.5 in November 2022. But when it comes to AI, like older type of technology, machine learning for prediction, for example, here often companies have been using this for years and have clear return on investment. For example, I don't know, all the big Booking, Netflix, Meta, Spotify, they will use machine learning and in particular deep learning for prediction, right? For recommendation algorithm to recommend our next trip, the next song or TV show we might like. And this is not about GenAI. It's better mastered, basically the output you would hope for, and you can track this benefit. But for GenAI, everything is a bit new, and I think you framed it very well. It echoes this hype cycle. You have basically ChatGPT 3.5 is out there. We are a bit scared, but we want to try back moving forward 2024. Companies are trying. 2025, they look back. Well, ROI is not there yet. So, what's your take? Have you seen some implementation of generative AI which seems to work, be more beneficial than others, or not yet anything very convincing?
When I've taken a look at some companies and their generative AI initiatives, I actually find some rather interesting pilots and ways of how and use cases of viewing it. And they're very company specific or industry specific. And I can tell you about some of them a little bit later. One of the things I do want to just go back to in terms of this conversation we're having is that I think we probably have to disentangle two things when we see a report like this. So I think there are two topics. The one topic I think they're talking about is this pilot to scaling or experimentation versus implementation. So I think that's one topic. And then the other topic that I think is being raised is so then how do you measure performance of new digital initiatives or new digital technologies? So I believe that what we're talking about is these two very different topics, and I think we need to disentangle these and we need to speak about them sequentially. So, but the question about how do you pilot a new technology such as Gen AI into scale, because we know that from our research and our understanding of any type of digital technology or digital initiative, that business value is typically created only after an initiative is rolled out at scale. So then the question really becomes then, so how do you go from startup to scale up? And that's a big challenge that we've always tried to figure out for a very long time. And it's not only Gen AI technologies, it's any type of digital technologies we've had in the past. And I think what we know, so before I studied Gen AI, one of the other things that we were doing at IMD was studying digital transformation in itself. And I think some of the learnings that we saw from digital transformation initiatives was a couple of things, right? So I think on one hand, if you really wanted to scale a digital initiative, I mean, there's one learning, we have a couple of learnings. One is, well, first you have to sort of align your scale with your ambition. So if you're thinking of implementing a digital, a new technology, if it's a custom application, then you can focus more your criteria towards usability, functionality, or compliance. But if you're going for like more general, big, ambitious projects that require scale, then there's other considerations you have to take into, such as, first of all, you need to make sure that it's integrated into your current IT landscape. And then you also have to look at the organizational and cultural resistance issues that come about. And then I think in terms of when you're trying to, again, scale something, you have to plan for that scale. So you really need to ask yourself, to make this scale, are there natural limits to growing this? What are so, how do you integrate it into like existing processes and projects, right? And so, for example, if you really wanted to scale, if the problem was about scale, what we know from digital initiatives, for example, some companies in the past, they used to actually have scaling reviews. So when they implemented a digital initiative, a chief digital officer at a company that we interviewed, they made sure that as soon as they knew there was some value coming out of that digital initiative, they would set up a parallel team to start working on all the issues related to scaling, such as the legal issues. Do you need another team for cybersecurity, for IT integration? So, it was really, the scaling was really planned out. And I think another scaling that you have to proactively plan for is to anticipate the skill gaps. So what we are one time you asked me about what are some Gen AI initiatives that are going on in most companies. So what I've seen is that a lot of companies are putting efforts into their internal upskilling of employees because they know that if they want to scale, they need to make sure all of their employees have some basic knowledge of how to use the technology. So I think that's one thing. But to your question, so here's a provocative straight statement for you. So if we have Gen AI, and if you want to scale Gen AI, right? The question about when we use Gen AI right now, we evaluate whether it's effective given how much contextual knowledge it has so that it does the job that we need it to do in a particular contextual way. But if that's how we're evaluating the effectiveness of a particular Gen AI application or a use case, on its contextuality. So if it's so specific and so contextual and so localized, how could that scale? Right? So it's a little bit paradoxical. So I think that's just a provocative idea that I had recently when I was thinking about this topic about scale and Gen AI, because Gen AI to be effective has to be so localized and contextualized. So that's one topic about from pilot to scale. And now when we talk about the topic about how do you measure? So yes, of course, you hear all these, for any type of new digital technology, everybody likes to think about ROI, the money aspect and investment like that. But we've also know from digital transformation that it's actually, especially for early technologies, it's very difficult to be calculating ROI on new technologies. And so, even when we researched digital transformation, we found that a lot of organizations were using rather generic success factors like adoption rates because it was so difficult to forecast or to forecast ROI, like in a financial ROI. And I know even from our digital transformation studies back in 2020, the Gartner did a study that almost 50% of the organizations they surveyed had actually no specific metrics for measuring digital success. So even preceding Gen AI or AI, a lot of companies just, it was very difficult to measure digital initiatives. And I think one of the best practices that we think is that having a bit more of a holistic view on how you might see Gen AI impact or new technology impact is probably the way to go because it is still a transformation journey rather than just the adoption or the implementation of a technology. And so just to give you a little bit of an idea, at IMD, at the center that I work for, we conceptualize something called AI maturity. And that looks at, it doesn't look at AI and how they're specifically using it and then calculating how that use leads to some type of business performance. But we sort of look at does an organization use and adopt this AI or Gen AI across 5 dimensions? So can we see that there is strong executive support for Gen AI, which we know in the adoption of new technologies, if there's no strong executive support, it's very difficult for an organization to adopt a new technology. So that's one. The second is, are they investing into the technology and the necessary infrastructure to make AI work within their organizations? The third one that we also look at is Are they using GenAI or AI for enhancing their operational efficiency internally? And so this is where we see some companies using AI for, so if you have a customer facing service, there are teams that use AI to help their customer service representatives with with knowledge that they can use to be able to answer the question more quickly. And then we also have the fourth dimension is, are they upskilling? As I mentioned, are they upskilling their workers on AI topics? And then the fifth one that we also consider to be rather important is, do they have an AI ethics policy in place? Because of course you can scale and you can adopt AI, but if you're not doing it in a pro-social manner or without the ethical frameworks uh, attached to it, you also expose your company to more risk. So those are the five dimensions we look at, which we think is a little bit more holistic, and maybe that's another way to look at. Um, I wouldn't call it return on investment, but a way of understanding how AI might eventually help with your
Mhm.
business performance.
Yeah, and I really like this broader view. Usually, I call this also, and it echoes the way I would see AI impacts using system thinking, right? Because
Mm,
it's multidimensional,
yeah.
it's complex, and also it's time varying. So it might be working today, but we know also with generative AI in particular, when you have this something you're working on, right? Human AI interaction. And there's a lot of even psychology or other aspects that we have to take into account. Maybe today, for example, we are able to measure a jump in productivity thanks to this new chatbot we released. But we know that we have also this longer term potential negative impact, which leads to a reversal of the effect, like uh, citing this paper called Falling Asleep at the Wheel. Basically, at the beginning, it works well. We're paying attention while using GenAI. At some point, we over trust the tool. We don't pay attention too much. We over rely on it. And suddenly, on the longer term, the quality is going down. So when we think about impact, it's indeed, it depends. It's very heterogeneous effect, as you said. It depends from the person who is using it, if they are trained, not trained, and also time varying. And I think it's indeed a very good advice to have this holistic or broader view, because the risk when you focus on ROI is to focus just on one metric, right?
Mm.
And forget about many other dimensions. Makes me think about the example of Klarna. Maybe Klarna, this fintech, who you say Gen AI first, or AI first, and then a few months after firing people, they rehired staff. Eventually, something that might happen is that on the short term, with your pilots, you see gains in productivity, reduction in cost, which might sound like a good signal. But maybe if the quality is not there, it's affecting more important metrics like brand loyalty, long term growth. And then it might backfire, even if on the short term, with your nice KPI, it looks good. So I think that I really appreciate how you bring this, also distancing yourself sometimes with this evolving technology from a clear, simplest, too simple KPI, and having this broader view.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you sort of integrate the two topics of pilot to scale and more a holistic view of how you might look at the ROI, which I don't know if we want to say it's the same as the impact, is the word impact, but also if you take a temporal view, uh, the pilot, of course, you don't, there could be, as you had mentioned, there could be that temporal right now type of impact in a limited view in a constrained area. But then, of course, if you scale it, it does take time. So you have to be patient, but then in scaling, there will also be other considerations you have to think about. So I think there's all these dimensions. I like the word that you meant system. It's temporal, it's multidimensional, and I think that's the type of conversation one could be having, and I think it's a more enriching conversation.
Yeah, and the difference you point to startup to scale up with all the complexities that might happen when you want to scale are incredibly valuable. I think what we're discussing really echoes actually the different steps, at least in some way, that you discuss in your HBR article. So your HBR article was about how to implement ethically, if I'm not mistaken, AI. And I think the first step is about education, and it could be for ethical implementation, but also just for implementation, just such that it work, not only for ethics, right? And you pick this very interesting metric. I'm curious. I guess it's from your own research, but you'll tell me. You found 79% of tech workers reporting a need for practical resources to help them navigate ethical concerns, and
Mhm.
how to translate this into practical guidance. So this was not from your research, but you cited this. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. It wasn't from my research. It was from, I'm trying to look for it now, but it was a survey done primarily in the US of some organizations. We can put it into the link when I
Yep.
find it later. But no, it's not from our research, but it is aligned with some academic reviews that were done about the gap that exists between AI ethics principles and then how they actually get implemented within an organization. And so there are like when you look at the AI ethics frameworks and AI principles, there have been several studies done that actually there's a lot of them out there globally. They're proliferating. So it's very, well, I think it is hard work to develop these frameworks and principles. There are quite enough of them already. So if an organization is wanting to or has a desire to first put an AI compass for how they would implement AI responsibly, they do not have to make it up from scratch. I would sort of suggest that there are many frameworks out there that they should look at and then see what resonates with their organization's mission and to develop that first. Because if you don't have an AI ethics framework spelled out, it is difficult to get your organization on board and then to translate it down. But that the work that we were doing with this particular Harvard Business Review article that you've mentioned was looking at a lot of organizations who already have some AI ethics framework already in place, but knowing that actually taking it from words and principles to action, a lot of organizations are having difficulty doing, and a lot of the employees who need to operationalize these principles are having difficulty doing. So that's what we were trying to look at. And so then so we interviewed, it was more qualitative. We interviewed several organizations which we identified as having these frameworks together, and then how they would actually translate these principles into action. And we found a couple of different insights. They're not comprehensive, but I think for organizations looking into this, it gives a little bit of a roadmap. So what we found is that once you have this ethics framework in place, one way to operationalize it is by keeping the two teams together. What happens in a lot of organizations is that there is a group, a central group, which is usually associated with compliance. They're put into the compliance teams. And then there's the digital teams, and the compliance and the digital teams often do not work together. But what we found is that if you want to actually operationalize some of these AI ethics principles, some of the organizations that we spoke to actually made sure that they were put together. So from a governance structure perspective, and I think on this one, Thomson Reuters, their ethics team, who was in charge of the ethics framework, worked closely together with the data and the data team and the modeling team. And then between them, they really tried to make sure that for every ethics principle, that they knew how to operationalize it with the data and the digital operations. So I think that's one way to make sure that it gets operationalized and that they speak the same language. So first of all, keep your compliance and the digital teams together. Related to that, of course, is also to make sure that you facilitate some type of dialogue between these teams. I know we also, in the article, we talked about the example of Deutsche Telekom, where they had these cross-disciplinary teams and they had to figure out how to implement, for example, an AI chatbot into their customer service. And what they realized, for example, was they had a principle of transparency where they wanted to ensure that if you called into a Deutsche Telekom customer service line and it was a AI chatbot that was going to be your initial contact, that they would have to transparently communicate that it was an AI chatbot. But then the marketing team would say, well, actually, if you have a introductory message that is rather long, saying, "Hi, I'm from Deutsche Telekom. Actually, I'm an AI service chatbot," and you go in to explain what that chatbot does, the marketing team at this meeting said, "Well, that's actually a very, very long statement, and the customer would probably hang up." And so, I think these are the types of situations where then you have to really think about it as a team to balance comprehensiveness, the principle, but then also what actually works from a customer service perspective. And you've got marketing involved as well. So the second takeaway was, make sure that you have that dialogue with the cross-functional teams, and it will actually take a long time, right? So you just can't just implement it without the context. And I think that one of the other things that I think those are the two principles we found of how you translate these abstract principles into operations.
Yeah, I really like how it ties back to what we were discussing before and the complexity of measuring the impact. Because basically, here again, it highlights perfectly well with this chatbot. Basically, do you do the right thing, if I can say, and state that you're talking with an AI, or you take the risk that eventually people find out that there is something weird, they think that and lose trust basically in the company, because that's something also not 100% reliable research yet. So a paper was published recently, a meta studies study about the impact of on trust from the customer when they realize that it's Gen AI
Mhm.
made from a company. So there are some signal that it affects trust, and that the
Yes,
worst is indeed if people find out and it was not clearly said. And I think here you see back to this point of multidimensionality and the complexity, and hence the fact that you need this conversation between different people, right? Because you highlight it perfectly well. You have some marketing incentives, but also some ethical incentives. And even if you think about just from the perspective of the company, again, maybe fewer people will hang up, but at the same time, if people find out later that it's a Gen AI chatbot and they were basically not sure about it, it might also affect the perspective, the again brand loyalty, or these very important long-term metrics.
definitely. I think it's a conversation about figuring out the how, balancing all of these perspectives and viewpoints because they're all valid. So can you find a balance that works for all?
Yeah, in your specific case, I guess, because it depends the type of clients, the type of companies, what you're doing. It's the same. I had the discussion on the last episode about when you use AI, evaluating the risk of failure. And
Mm,
for example, if you have again the person, Aline Auge, took the example of if Spotify do not recommend you the best music you like, that's kind of okay. You don't
mm,
listen to it, or you maybe reduce a little bit the time on the platform. But if a chatbot or AI is used for welfare recommendation, it has been done in some countries, and suddenly it misallocate the welfare or refuse the welfare to a family who need this money, and then it leads to some dramatic consequences for a family, it's very important to weight the costs of the potential mistake, and hence can we delegate this to an AI, or do we still prefer to eventually go slower, but have at least a human in the loop to check this? And yeah,
No, yeah, I agree.
so the main thing is indeed clearly this integration and cross discussion between the departments. And I really like because it's really following your recommendation, basically what you discuss in this HBR piece. The fact that it should be it's the fourth point, if I'm not mistaken. You should proliferate, right? You should be sure that everybody in the company can work together and have this information. So very clearly, education is key, and connecting these different people have to work together. But how do you do this? Do you have champions in different departments who are representing their department with respect to AI, and these champions work together? Or do you have one
Mm.
department that's overview everything? What are the practice you've seen that seems to work? Is it decentralized or rather centralized?
Yeah, so this is an ongoing two different models. So do centralize or decentralize. What we found with most organizations is that there is a central unit that is responsible for developing more on the, I would say more on the policy perspective. And they either sit in compliance or they sit in some type of digital initiatives office. And then many of them, in terms of, so there's two things, right? So in terms of the central team has a couple of different responsibilities. So one is they develop the framework for how the organization might operate. So they develop the policies for that. And for example, in terms of that, I would call it a central governance type of mechanism. And for example, when we look at an organization, they would put together how AI ethics, for example, can be incorporated into the AI product service development process. And they would have stage gate processes of what needs to happen. A lot of organizations that we spoke to had a document and the ethics principles. It was a I would call it a self-reporting tool where if you were responsible for developing an AI tool, that you would go ahead and use these checklists and you would have to submit it to the central office. And only once it's been reviewed by, usually there is also a central AI ethics committee that reviews at a stage gate process for it to then go ahead and be developed. So that is, again, a central mechanism that happens. Um, with some companies, they would also, with that central team, they would go ahead and audit randomly some AI tools that were being in development just to ensure that the AI ethics principles were being operationalized at the point of development. So I think that's
Mhm.
the good thing there. But then once you have so that's on the product development side. So how can you make sure that the AI ethics principles are integrated and incorporated into the product or service that you develop? Now then, the question that you had, Quantan, about proliferating and educating the organization, because of course you can have all these tools and rules and mechanisms to ensure that AI ethics gets baked into the tools that you might develop. But at the same time, if you could educate and make people aware, and if you could make people internalize these principles, that would actually be more powerful, right? Because they're a little bit more proactive rather than blindly following a tool. So in that respect, what we've found is that many companies have identified ethical AI, the sort of AI champions. I think we've seen this model a lot in technology diffusion. And it is those AI ethics champions that would go ahead and at a local level make sure they promote and incorporate different things. Another way of diffusion is that some organizations would have communities of practice. and that these expert communities of practice would come together and discuss different AI ethics implementations and then sort of bring that up to the wider organization. So I think those are some other ways to do it. Um, in terms of the education and awareness, um, again, I think these are a lot of organizations would do things such as webinars and trainings or hackathons in that respect. And I think one of the other things that we had in our HBR article was the fact that the thing is with Gen AI or AI tools and services, they evolve. Some need to be deprecated because they are no longer matching what they need to be doing. So you need to have an environment that always tinkers so that the model that you have is um, is reflective of what's happening because the risks evolve over time, the conditions evolve over time, the technologies also change. For example, let's look at ChatGPT. They're always launching new updates. And all of these language models are always updating. So how can you sort of what we call calibrate to make sure that your AI solutions are always relevant and they continue to be held responsible. So, what we say with this one is it's really important to, when you develop the AI product, know that this is just the beginning of the life cycle. And then actually, the real question is how do you ensure that your teams and all your employees involved with this product can sustain the momentum to make sure that they follow the AI tool that they developed all the way up until the end once it's already out in the field. And one way that I know some companies have done it, I know, for example, a Swiss company, D Mobilia, they really try to, what they've been striving to do with their AI efforts is to make sure that, again, they have an interdisciplinary team that works on it, but they also try to position AI ethics, responsible AI as a value driver and not just as a compliance burden. Because once people believe it's a compliance burden, it's just something that they don't want to do. But if they see it maybe as something that would provide value, I think you had mentioned trust, enhancing trust. These things are what we would call value drivers that could be really important. And the other thing that we believe is very important is to make sure that you always are in sync with evolving standards. It's also important if you're an organization that is trying to wade into this for the first time to have external partnerships. Some industries have created these sort of industry associations or alliances where the representatives come and they talk to each other in a safe space where they talk about their AI implementations and they ask each other questions. Other organizations, especially in the US, there've been a lot of responsible AI partnerships and alliances where they're getting up-to-date information as well about regulatory concerns. So I think these are where you have to just be very attuned to the external environment, just to make sure everything, what you do internally and externally is in sync.
So back to that was spot on. I was exactly going to bring the calibrate because it's your point on the HBR because indeed that's a key aspect when we think about impact and implementation. How hard it is if you have this additional layer that the tool itself it's constantly evolving. Not only the tool itself, for example, you might have some changes on one chatbot in particular, but then also you have other that are released and maybe are more efficient. So when we discussed, and I really like the starting of this conversation about how do you go from startup to scale up, or how do you scale at least a project? I guess this is a huge challenge, right? The fact that it's constantly evolving. So the time you start investing and moving something forward, maybe it's too late, maybe it's already obsolete. So what are your main advices or what have you witnessed to be more flexible and address basically this challenge that you probably want to scale, so you have to move fast, but at the same time, the entire landscape is moving fast. How do you ensure that you're once you get there and starting scaling up, it's not too late?
Yeah. What we found is that some organizations they see themselves as support rather than compliance. So it's would be about of course you've got a team that is always looking at the external environment just to make sure that if the model is degrading that they get the feedback and they have a system in place to be able to incorporate those inputs and feedback. So I think that's the first thing for sure. The second thing is, I think it also goes back to this ongoing support, because on one hand, I think it is just a reality that once you finish with some type of development or if you launch a product, that sometimes you might with a lot of these new AI products and services that one even if you want to scale them, there's also a tendency for some organizations to take a let 1,000 flowers bloom. So you go in for the next new idea that you might have and put resources into that. So, I think that happens. But on the other hand, how can you make sure that the initiative that you launched is sustained and it's also supported? And that if you're on the ground, maybe you don't have the information to be able to understand more of the also regulatory level, what are the do's and don'ts as it evolves as well. And I think in that respect, it is nice to be able to have a central expert team that is accountable for understanding that evolving landscape and that expert team is used as a consultant on projects, or sometimes they also, I know another organization who has what they call an internal ethical certification that needs to be updated once every 2 years or once every year. And that allows people to constantly go back and reassess their product or their service based on the ethical certification, which should be updated or which should be reflected in their updates with the external environment. So I think these are some tactics that are being used to make sure that it's still calibrated. The other tactic that I've also seen used is that then the central team goes in and does some random audits just to make sure that everything is going fine. So there are all these different mechanisms, both internal in terms of awareness, but also external guardrails that can help an organization make sure that it continues to be calibrated and that the attention is focused on these efforts.
If we take a step back and think about the big picture, because we started with this metric of the arguably 95 projects, pilots of GenAI fails. But even if we don't necessarily, as we said, trust entirely this metric, it seems that there is some kind of truth behind it at least. Some pilots are not working. It's the purpose of a pilot. But also, based on this evidence, some people claimed we will enter soon a new AI winter. And I'm curious about your perspective on this big picture. Do you think that actually now more and more people, at least with respect to generative AI, we will enter into this AI winter where more companies enter basically I'm not sure about the word, but basically entering this less smaller hype and delusion, and so they think, okay, let's stop with our Gen AI initiative, or not necessarily. What do you think?
Hmm. I think we are perhaps at an inflection point. So um, I believe that there will still be continuing interest in adopting AI. I think the adoption will continue to sustain itself. When we talk about AI winter, it's not really about the technology, but it's more about how do we use it effectively for what we want. And I think it seems as if many organizations are still struggling to find that right formula and the combination. What I can tell you from a management research perspective, as we in the management field are looking at the topic of AI, there is one discussion about whether do you see AI as a tool or increasingly as a teammate. And I think that's sort of, I feel in the context of your question, I think it's an interesting. and lens to look at. Because if you look at AI as a tool, and it's primarily used as a productivity tool, I think there is certain evidence to show that AI could be used to enhance productivity in different types of roles. But increasingly, perhaps there's expectations of AI as being a semi-autonomous agent that could probably have more capabilities, more than a tool, but still not quite at the level of a human. And so if you take a look at that, perhaps these descriptions of an AI winter is because we still haven't figured out how to best use AI as a semi-autonomous agent and as a teammate. And if we're able to figure that out, and do we want the AI to be a teammate? I think there's also these types of questions, which could be, this is a cultural resistance question that we had. So I don't know if it's a winter is more that we're still in that perhaps we're in a transition period of trying to figure out AI as a potential teammate because we already know that as a tool, as a productivity tool, it has benefits. So there's no skepticism about that. But I think we're still trying to figure out where can AI be valued as a semi-autonomous agent, as a teammate. And I think that's perhaps where the discussion might be going.
Very interesting. Indeed, we see more and more. It has been since already a year that more and more we talk about agentic AI, but it's taking more shape and more promises. And recently, you also have like implementation from Copilot within Excel with capabilities that are specific. And eventually, I like this suggestion or in this direction that maybe it will not be one tool for everything, but rather different specific tools for different specific tasks. And also, this story about tool or teammate is very interesting. I had this long conversation and one podcast episode with Charles Ayubi, who is professor at ESSEC, but he was a postdoc at HBS, and he co-authored this fantastic paper called the cybernetic teammate. And basically, you probably know about it, but also for the audience, this is this randomized experiment where they study at Procter & Gamble during a hackathon how people working alone or with AI created some solutions, basically. And indeed, basically, the conclusion of the paper is going in this direction. Well, GenAI is closer to a teammate because of the type of results when you work with this tool and also even the emotional response. So in their paper, they track this and show that the negative and positive emotions were similar between person alone with AI than people working with a team. And I find this kind of conversation anyway very interesting. And
Yeah.
before concluding, also there is one last topic that I think. So two last things I wanted to ask you. So first, if you can try in a very condensed way to give advice because that was really neat parts we started with. If companies want to scale, what are the main advices if you have to just do it in from small pilots to scale up? What are the things they should pay attention to?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think if you're planning to scale, make sure that you bake that in from the beginning, which means that you should have your objective and also be able to find the stage gate perspectives of when you will start putting in a parallel team and you start assembling your resources for scaling. And so you're identifying at which point you will go ahead and scale and what the criteria is for making that decision.
Very good. Thank you very much. And one last, because it's a completely different topic, but you mentioned this. I saw this at least in your bio that also sometimes you advocate for women in tech, and I do think that it's incredibly important to promote this. Not only because I have two daughters and work in tech, but I mean also during the podcast so far I had two-thirds of the guests were women. It just happened to be like this, and it was a huge pleasure to exchange with people from different gender, but also different place in the world to have a full perspective. And maybe if I can just turn to you in to know what are your advices for maybe for women listening to podcast to how to make it in tech, or what would be the main thing you would like to share on this topic with me and the audience today.
Mm. So originally my training was in general management, and I only got into tech about 8 to 10 years ago after a corporate experience, which was non-tech, although I was leading a marketing digital transformation. So what would I suggest for women perhaps getting into technology? So I think so I would be identifying your entry point. So I think there's an entry point of women who can educate themselves. So maybe they have an engineering, they can choose depending on where you are in your career or your education right now, perhaps at the start of the funnel, you've got there is the discussion of how can more younger women get into STEM subjects that would sort of lead them into tech. So that is very much at the beginning of the funnel. But if you are already in midway through the funnel and you perhaps did not go through an engineering background or a tech background, and my advice would be to have an interest in some of the technology issues, but you may already have a specific domain that you have background. So you may have been trained as a lawyer, or you may have been trained as a social scientist, or you may have been trained in philosophy. And all of these, what I believe is that all of these different domains, there is an intersection with technology. So you can still enter into this technology discussion through with the expertise or the domain that you have. And it's about finding the intersection between that. And I would say that even students or people who have a philosophy background are very much valued given the conversations we're having today. So that's at the mid-career level. And I think then now also if you're planning, if you've had a long career, and then you have a curiosity towards technology, and it may not be for your career, but you're just interested. I think at this point, I think also there is a lot of discussion to be had about more of the societal impacts and benefits of technology. And I think we have to, as a society, have an educated discussion about that. So in me, if it's not really related for a career per se, but if you're just curious about technology, I think that aspect would be really interesting to educate yourself on, so that you as a citizen could have an informed and contribute to the discussion of AI and technology impacts on society.